Today's Friday Forum is made possible by Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plan, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I am John Horvick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, our speakers will discuss the future of the Bonneville Power Administration. But first, some announcements. And before I begin, I'd like to recognize someone in the audience today, Charlotte Schwartz. Charlotte had to step away recently, but she has been a regular attender at Friday Forums for 40 years. We're so pleased to have you back. And if you could, please join me in giving her a warm round of applause to welcome her back with us. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Family Care Health Plans, Miller Nash, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. City Club will launch a membership drive next week, and we are counting on all of you here today and listening on the radio to become a member. We know that you want to support our Friday Forums and our citizen-led research. We know you want us to advocate for solutions to the issues affecting all Oregonians. Help us continue our work for the next year by becoming a member. For a limited time, you can join City Club for only $98 for the year, and even less if you're under 31. We want to get a head start today, and so those of you in the audience who are not yet members, please join today. Our staff is ready to assist you with registration in the back. Next week, we are pleased to welcome Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, to discuss whether ending homelessness is a pipe dream or a possibility. Are you running for office or want to know more about the candidates? Well, our next Civic Drinks networking event on April 8th at the Brazier in downtown Portland will be an opportunity for people who are running for office to attend and chat with voters. You can learn more about these and other club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. Join us in live tweeting today's event. You can follow or mention us at PDXCityClub, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. As always, we'll be having a Q&A session with our speakers at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. And for all our audience participants, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. Today, Elliot Mainzier, new administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration, will present a vision for how this vital institution will use its leadership to ensure clean and affordable electricity and environmental stewardship to the Pacific Northwest. Last July, Mr. Mainzier stepped into the acting administrator role at BPA after the previous leadership resigned in the wake of hiring irregularities at the administration. In January 2014, he was officially named the permanent BPA administrator. Over the last several months, he has led the agency by maintaining focus on its critical mission and services, while seeking to address and correct the problems at BPA. Mr. Mainzier now has the task to rebuild relationships in the region and restore trust in BPA as a public institution charged with assuring an adequate, efficient, economical, and reliable power source. Interviewing Mr. Mainzier is Lisa Rackner. Ms. Rackner is a shareholder in the Portland Energy and Telecommunications law firm, McDonnell, Rackner, and Gibson, where she provides regulatory and transactional advice to natural gas and electric utilities and telecommunications carriers. She represents clients before the Public Utility Commission of Oregon, the Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council, and the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. And so now, without further ado, please help me welcome our speakers to the stage.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here today. When most Oregonians think of BPA, two images come to mind, that of the Bonneville Dam and fish hatcheries. While these represent two important aspects of what BPA does, we know it's not the whole story. And so, Elliot, just to get us started today and provide some context for the rest of our conversation, was hoping you could provide us with a brief overview of what it is BPA does and perhaps a little bit of history as well.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Lisa. And good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and it's wonderful to be here. I've been looking forward to today. Bonneville is a very, very interesting organization. It has a very rich history and is in many ways a creature of statute. When you go back to the 1930s, 1937 exactly, to the beginning of BPA, we were created through a law known as the Bonneville Project Act, right in the middle of the Great Depression, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the goal was to get the Bonneville Dam built and then to link it up with transmission lines and bring the power to cities like Portland and Seattle. Eventually, the Grand Coulee Dam was built. And over time, over the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, we eventually, through the region, constructed 31 big federal dams and about 15,000 miles of transmission capacity. Bonneville is actually the marketing agent for those dams. The actual individual facilities themselves are owned and operated by the Army Corps of Engineers and by the Bureau of Reclamation, but we're the marketing agent, and our core customer base has traditionally been what is known as the preference customers. See, this is small farm and municipal, primarily rural electric customers, which were the major focus during the Roosevelt administration in a period when we were really focusing on rural electrification. So that core preference customer base and public power has historically been our core constituency. For many years, Bonneville was really the largest single source of electricity in the region by far. As a matter of fact, back in the 40s, when we built the Grand Coulee Dam, many people thought that there would never be enough demand for the electricity from that facility. It's a 6,000 megawatt dam. It's absolutely enormous. But by the time we got into World War II and we were fighting the war overseas, it suddenly became very convenient to have all that electricity production to bring aluminum plants out and to build B-17s and eventually win the war of attrition against the Germans and the Japanese, to also build some big nuclear research facilities, et cetera. And then through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we continued to grow as an organization. The big building period of the dams came to an end primarily in the 70s. And today, here we are as a major regional organization that sort of serves as the backbone of the Northwest power grid. Now, whereas for many years, we were the largest single provider of electricity. Now, in 2014, we're surrounded by a lot of other large entities as well. We have Portland General Electric, we have PacifiCorp, we have other regional utilities. So our contribution to power supply is now only about a third of the region's power supply. But that low-cost, clean hydroelectricity is still a very, very foundational part of the region's electricity system. And we provide a lot of other very important functions. We are very involved in energy efficiency. We're extraordinarily involved in fish and wildlife, and something that we've gotten increasingly involved with in the last decade has been renewable energy integration. I'll just make one last point. I'm sure many of you have been out on Highway 84, and you've seen all the wind turbines that are spinning out there in Sherman County, right? Well, all of those wind plants are physically interconnected into the Bonneville transmission system. Okay, we sell them transmission services, but the vast majority of that electricity is not sold to Bonneville's preference customers. It's actually wheeled or transmitted across the transmission lines to other utilities in the region. It goes to Puget Sound Energy, it goes to Portland General, PacifiCorp, some utilities in California. What we do is we provide the transmission services on an open access basis, and we also use the hydro system to ramp up and down to maintain reliability, to manage the variability of all those wind turbines. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of functions of what we provide. I guess the last thing I'll say, there are a couple important things. Statutorily, I mentioned the Bonneville Project Act in 1937. In 1974, there was another act known as the Transmission Act, which was passed, is a very important piece of legislation because it basically put Bonneville on a self-financing basis. And it's a very important part of our regional identity is that instead of being an appropriated organization, we're able to borrow money through the U.S. Treasury to finance our capital program, but we pay back the government and the Treasury through sales of electricity and transmission capacity. And every September, we mail back a big check to the U.S. government. Last year, it was about $692 million to cover that federal investment. And so that's a very important part of us being a self-financing organization. And then in 1980, there was a very monumental piece of legislation that was passed in the region known as the Northwest Power Act. And the Northwest Power Act really defined very much the sort of modern shape of Bonneville. It defined our rate processes, it defined our role in energy efficiency, fish and wildlife protection, and renewable resource facilitation. Now, the one thing that was funny about the Northwest Power Act, great story, I guess one of the key negotiators came back from the table and somebody said to him, well, how did the negotiations go? And he said, well, fantastic. The good news is, I think we got just about everything we wanted. The bad news, of course, is that everybody else did. And so the Northwest Power Act is a very complicated piece of legislation to administer. So that's a little bit of the history of Bonneville in a nutshell. It's a fascinating history and something I've enjoyed reading about over the years.
Thank you so much, and we are going to come back to many of the issues that you have just touched on. But before we dive into the more specifics, I wanted to ask you about an issue that I think is on many of our minds today. Last year, BPA was in the headlines facing serious allegations about deficiencies in its hiring practices that discriminated against veterans and also claims of retaliation against whistleblowers. The Department of Energy's audit report found that the problems were so pervasive, one DOE official stated, the level of effort needed to complete all required corrective actions is monumental, and the road to full recovery will be extremely challenging. Despite all the coverage, there's been little detail in the press about what actually happened at Bonneville, and I was hoping you could shed some light on that and then talk about what Bonneville is doing to correct the problems.
Sure. I guess I'll start. I feel compelled to start by answering the question just by saying, I've worked at BPA for 12 years. I was the deputy administrator when all this happened, and I will say I've worked in probably 5 or 6 different parts of BPA. And generally, personally, my experience has been extraordinarily positive. It's been a very wonderful place to work with very healthy work environments. But I will definitely say, and I think we've tried to own this, that we had some significant management problems in our human capital management organization. The bottom line, I think, is that a number of years ago, we tried to get the group to run a little bit more like a private sector organization, to be a little bit.
Excuse me, so when you say human capital management, you're referring to your human resources?
Human resources, yeah, thanks. Human resources organization. And we tried to get it to run a little bit more efficiently, but back in, I think, early 2010, there was an executive order passed that required some new hiring practices to be put into place. And quite frankly, we misinterpreted those hiring practices. We didn't apply what was known as a category ranking process appropriately. And at the end of the day, instead of sort of picking up the phone and wrestling the issue to ground with our colleagues back in the department who we have to work with on these issues, we sort of let the issue smolder. There were people in that organization who were not happy that it was going on. They raised their hand and said, this is a big problem. The problems persisted, and instead of bringing them to successful resolution, they snowballed to the point that they erupted in a full-on scandal for all intents and purposes, which cost us our CEO and our chief operating officer. And we found that we didn't have necessarily the right skills and the right training to run a fully compliant human resources operation. One of the things people don't recognize, Bonneville today is, we are part of the Department of Energy. And we are known as a separate and distinct entity within the DOE. But at the end of the day, many of my authorities as administrator come through the Secretary of Energy, and we have to fully comply with the federal hiring laws. And we were not doing that to the extent that we needed to. And the department and the Office of Personnel Management and others came down on us very, very hard and identified some very significant problems. And quite frankly, we've had to spend the last year fixing them. And it hasn't been easy. What we found is just kind of amazing. We have had to actually go back and reconstruct every one of the hiring actions that we took on from 2010 through the middle of 2013. That's 1,260 individual hiring actions. And in every one of those cases, we have to go through and make sure that if there was an individual, including a veteran, who may have been disadvantaged by the way that we ran the hiring, that they are actually able, they actually receive a job offer. Now, we've gone through over half of the cases now, and we have found that many of the cases were okay, but quite a few of them did have some issues, and we've actually offered 60 new jobs, primarily to veterans who were disadvantaged by our hiring practices. About 22 of them have already accepted the jobs and are actually coming into the business. But we're going to spend the rest of the year finishing that reconstruction process. The second thing we did is we went out and we actually finally, this is kind of a no-brainer, but we hired a highly skilled new human resources director with a background in federal law. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to comply with the federal laws. We need somebody with the expertise. And we've retrained all of our people. And we are on track now to recover the delegated, what are called our delegated examining authorities, our hiring delegated authorities from the Department of Energy by the end of this fiscal year. And I think we're making some real progress. It's costing us some money. It breaks my heart to have to tell our customers that we're spending money to fix this. But we're bringing new people into the workforce. They're being successfully integrated, and our hope is that by strengthening our communication channels with the folks of the Department of Energy's Human Resources Group, that we're never going to see anything like this happen at BPA again. But it has been very destabilizing for our workforce, and it's been very upsetting for us. We're an organization that prides ourselves on public service, and it's the kind of thing that just can't happen.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're on the road to recovery. One question that someone recently asked me when they heard that I was going to be talking to you was, we've heard that a number of the people who had been initially denied positions have been given offers. Are there enough open positions at Bonneville to allow the company to provide offers to anyone who was wrongfully denied a job without displacing people who are already there?
That has been our experience so far. Yeah, we still have about 130 existing vacancies at BPA, and our hope and our expectation is that we will be able to fill positions using those existing vacancies. We've told our employees, who you can imagine would be extremely nervous, especially anybody that was hired from 2010 to 13, that they might lose their job, that we are going to do everything in our power to avoid that from happening. And so far, we haven't had to do it.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us today. I think if you live in the Northwest, you know people who work at Bonneville, and I think it's always been all of our experience that Bonneville hires the best and the brightest and most ethical. It was a surprising thing when the scandal arose, but it sounds like you're on the right track. It's good to hear.
Well, thank you. I think that's right. I appreciate it.
Well, I guess I had one more question, and do you believe that the revised hiring processes will contribute to a more transparent hiring system and a more diverse agency?
Yeah, I think it will. I think the most important thing is, look, the basic mechanics of the human resources machine were just not functioning as effectively as they needed to. And so one of the things is we're hoping to run certainly much more responsive, much more timely, and at the end of the day, legally compliant obligation. That's the most important thing. One of the sort of tragic ironies of this situation, because it became very much an issue about veterans, is we already had about 700 veterans in our workforce. I think we'd even been recognized for having a very large number of veterans in our workforce. And we're excited actually to get a few more because, quite frankly, they're fantastic workers. I mean, a lot of these folks that come in from the military backgrounds, they're incredibly organized, and they've got amazing work ethics, and they just bring a great element to the workforce. So that's going to be nice. We're embracing them. And then I just think that the machinery of our hiring apparatus, which is so important, would just be more functional and more responsive. And that's, I think, the most important thing.
Thank you. You mentioned the authority over hiring that DOE has kind of taken unto themselves recently. And I think that rekindled a long-standing concern that many Oregonians have had about their ability to retain local or at least regional decision-making at BPA. Is that a real concern?
It's a fair concern, and I mean, I think that many of us who've grown up around BPA recognize just how important this organization is to this region. the power system. You just think about what happens when the lights go out. It's incredibly important. We have folks here from other utilities today who have the same public service obligation. So the role of Bonneville in the region as a public service organization, being accountable to this region, its citizens, our congressional delegation, is very, very much a part of our identity. And it has been and will be for a long time. But we also are a part of the Department of Energy. I report to the Deputy Secretary of Energy, who reports to the Secretary, and we are a separate and distinct element within the department. And they have a certain level of responsibility to make sure that we are compliant with the federal laws. And so they felt, and I think in some ways it was appropriate, that they need to make sure that we are on the right path from the administrative perspective. But what I will say is that in terms of big policy issues, in terms of big decision making around the future of the grid, or around our rates, or the Columbia River Treaty, or around market design, or big policy issues, the department traditionally has, and I think is now staying very hands-off on that. I've met directly with the deputy, I've met directly with the Secretary of Energy. They have no interest in controlling BPA's policy agenda, but they do feel a sense of responsibility to make sure that we're on the straight and narrow with respect to compliance. I think that's appropriate, and the better that we do a job tending our knitting, the more freedom we will have to make policy decisions in the best interest of the region.
I want to switch gears to talk a little bit about infrastructure. We frequently hear references to the nation's aging energy infrastructure. And most recently, we've seen that a relatively small crack in the Wanapum Dam has had far-reaching effects on the Columbia River power production and fish habitats. How concerned are you about the physical integrity of the Columbia River dams?
Well, it's a very important question. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wanapum Dam, there are actually 5 dams up on the mid-stem of the Columbia River up in central Washington that are owned by non-federal entities, public utility districts in the state of Washington. One of them is the Wanapum Dam. It's located up there by the Gorge Amphitheater. You might have seen that up in Washington. It's about a 1,000 megawatt dam. Anyway, several weeks ago, they found a crack, 2-inch by 65-foot long crack in one of the spillways. I'll never forget hearing about that, because you just don't think about that very often, that these dams could actually be facing those kinds of problems. Fortunately, Grant Public Utility District is doing, I think, a very good job of getting ahead of that problem and wrestling it to ground. But it does remind us that we are dealing with aging infrastructure. The hydro system that we manage was built between 1909 and 1970. Many of these facilities are, over close to 100 years old. And so we have a huge responsibility and a very significant spending obligation ahead of us to care and feed for these facilities. So I will say one of the biggest things that I'm focused on as administrator is making sure that we have an investment plan to really maintain the health and vitality of the power system and the transmission facilities, because we can't afford to get ourselves in a situation like that. And we have to stay ahead of that curve of depreciation. So far, we've been fortunate not to have problems like that. I'm not personally overly preoccupied or worried that we have any acute problems like that in any of our facilities, but it's critical that we stay ahead of it from an O&M perspective, operations and maintenance.
We also hear specific references to the nation's aging transmission system. Are old transmission lines a problem, and how can they be updated and repaired?
Old transmission lines, yes, they can definitely be a problem. I get back to my point about what happens when the lights go out. We rely on these transmission lines that are strung out there throughout the region to deliver electricity to cities. This is the infrastructure that helps us keep the lights on. And when those facilities start to age, a lot of the old wood poles and these steel towers, you can start getting into reliability problems, and you can literally get yourself into times when the lights are going out. That's not something we can afford in this modern economy. So again, as with the power side, we have a very significant capital plan and investment asset strategy on our transmission lines. And many of the other regions' utilities are doing the exact same thing, staying ahead of that curve. And so on both the whole core physical infrastructure of the grid that underlies the Pacific Northwest needs to be taken care of and nurtured and maintained so they can continue to provide value.
So are you dealing with an issue of deferred maintenance, where maintenance that perhaps should have been happening, you're now having to catch up, or is this just, the continuation of what always needs to happen?
I don't think it's really, it's a good question. It's not an overly, it's not hugely associated with deferred maintenance. There's some of that for sure. I would say, that the mid-1990s and early 2000s were a very destabilizing period in our industry. We had deregulation, then we had the California power crisis. Utilities weren't necessarily making a lot of the investments they needed to. So there's a little bit of a lag, but I would say we're certainly very much on it now in terms of the asset management strategies. So not as much of that.
So more on transmission. I guess I'd ask, is there a need for additional transmission? We sometimes hear that there is, and I was hoping you would speak a little bit about the challenges of adding transmission, especially in light of environmental regulations.
Well, there definitely is a need in certain parts of the grid for new transmission. We've been fortunate at Bonneville over the last few years to have actually been able to successfully construct some new transmission. We've worked very closely with our customers and with other stakeholders and our regulators to develop some new processes that allow us to actually finance and build and subscribe new transmission. And we built some new 500 kV lines, helped get all those wind plants out there in Sherman County over to Portland. We're working on construction of a couple of additional facilities right now, one of them that's going to help Portland General integrate a bunch of its wind projects. And the big one that we're looking at is a reinforcement of what's known as the I-5 corridor down through central Washington. It is not easy to get these lines built. I mean, you think back to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s when we had a relatively unpopulated region. You just sort of drew a line on the map and built transmission. Those days are over. The population has grown incredibly quickly. The permitting requirements, the siting requirements, the land acquisition costs, run-ins with protected species. It takes huge amounts of time and resources to get these lines built. And it's tough, and I think all the utilities are facing this. We're trying to help the public meet its public purpose and reliability objectives, but we run into a lot of obstacles. And so you just got to keep your head down and try to get it done.
Yeah, over lunch we were talking about the fact that BPA is a funding partner along with Idaho Power and PacifiCorp for permitting a 300-mile transmission line running from Boardman to southern Idaho. And because my firm is representing Idaho Power in that permitting process, I'm acutely aware of how complex and lengthy the process is. And this one's been going on since 2008. The permits are now estimated that we will get them 2017. That's the most recent estimate. And so my question to you is the lengthy permitting process, can it cause problems down the line? And from your position at BPA, can anything be done to speed up that process?
It absolutely can cause problems. It literally, if you don't have the actual transfer capacity, if you don't have the line in the air to move power from generators to loads, eventually you run into reliability problems or scarcity, in which the price of electricity can really skyrocket. So both of those are significant concerns, and we haven't found any miracles yet that allow us to really expedite the process. There's been a number of efforts to try to bring regional permitting organizations at the federal and state level together to coordinate better. I won't say any of those have been real game changers yet. And so, quite frankly, what we're having to do is we're having to do contingency planning to figure out what we'd actually have to do in the case that some of these lines get even further delayed. And what we're actually having to look at is what we call demand response, potentially. We might have to actually curtail or reduce load under certain circumstances. We're looking at potentially having to put generators in the ground in certain places in lieu of transmission lines. It's known as non-wires solutions. Some of these type of approaches may make sense on their own, just intrinsically. It might be actually more cost effective in some cases to build a generator or a demand response resource in lieu of a new transmission line. But at some point you run into just sheer physics and economics where you really do need that new line. And in that case, you're doing it from a contingency planning basis until you can finally get the facility built. And so we're really hoping that we will continue to get the support we need from regional policymakers, governors, et cetera, who can help us as the utility industry get the infrastructure built that people really need.
Okay, well, we'll be waiting.
Yeah, I'll be waiting there with you, right?
I want to switch to another subject with respect to physical infrastructure. Last April, a sniper attack knocked out a San Jose substation that funnels electricity into the Silicon Valley. And while the utilities were able to prevent a blackout by rerouting power, it took 27 days to get that substation up and running. Many in the industry believe that the attack was an act of terrorism. Is BPA concerned about protecting the grid from domestic and international terrorism? And if so, what are you doing about it?
We are concerned about this issue. I would not say that we are hysterically concerned about this issue, but I would say we're concerned enough about it, and quite frankly have been concerned enough about it for the last 10 to 15 years, that we've gone out and done a pretty comprehensive risk assessment of our entire grid to find those facilities that we think are critical to reliability, that could potentially be exposed to threats, and then we've taken protective measures to make sure that folks can't take negative impact, can't take negative steps towards them. I worry a little bit about this conversation in this country right now because we need to be careful that we're not sort of arming people with information where they can turn around and start harming our critical facilities. That's not very useful. And so I've been quite concerned about the release of very sensitive information into the media and folks kind of putting stuff out there that could sort of aid and abet this kind of stuff. What we need to do as the utility community is make sure we're focusing on those critical facilities, getting them protected, and then not, creating fodder for potential abuse.
So in addition to concern about physical attacks on infrastructure, I know you've spoken in your speeches about cybersecurity. Can you tell us what you mean by cybersecurity and what BPA is doing in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, we are, we are equally, I would say in some ways, have really been ramping up the focus on cybersecurity in some ways even more in the last couple of years because, you can get a cyber attack from any place in the world, right? You're operating these very, very big pieces of interconnected infrastructure, lots of electronics, and people, as we know, try all day long from overseas to try to hack into these critical systems. So we've had to work really, really hard to strengthen the firewalls on our critical systems and to make sure that we don't have the kind of vulnerabilities that somebody could launch an internet-based cyber attack on our critical systems. That could be equally, if not more, destructive. And I think every utility in the country, every operator of major high-tech infrastructure is having to deal with this right now. And it's very difficult to stay against it. You think about your own computer, the virus software that you have on your own computers. Typically your virus software is only good against existing viruses. And then something gets in and you're constantly playing this game of catch-up. So we're having to really, really put a lot of resources into staying ahead of that curve.
Thank you. I want to move to some questions about the environment. We all know that hydropower is a clean and renewable resource compared in particular to fossil fuels. Yet at the same time, we know that the dams are not without environmental impact, in particular on salmon and steelhead populations. Can you talk about what BPA is doing to protect the region's fish populations?
I certainly can. So this is a huge issue for this region, and I sort of tried to think a bit in sort of a big picture context because it gets to the heart of so many complex challenges of modern society. I mean, there is no doubt that when we built the hydroelectric system, that it had a major impact on the Columbia River. Had a major impact on fish and habitat, and it had a major impact on the Native American folks who had depended on the river. And I think in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that became a much more increasingly apparent issue than it was in the 30s and 40s. And I think that over the last 30 years, quite frankly, we've really raised the consciousness of that issue in this region. I can tell you Bonneville Power Administration itself has spent about $13 billion since 1978 improving the dams and trying to find ways to increase passage and survival for salmon because it's clearly impacted them. And especially in the last several years, we've really worked hard to collaborate with the states and the tribes, NOAA, the Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, to really take steps to maximize the survival of the fish, not only just beyond the dams, but also to increase our investments in habitat and the hatcheries that can help supplement those populations. Just in January, NOAA Fisheries came out with what was known as the 2014 Supplemental Biological Opinion.
And NOAA is
the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and basically saying that they think we're moving in the right direction. And we feel as BPA that we've got a lot of extraordinarily dedicated people inside the organization and our partners who are really trying to do the right thing here. Now, there are folks in the region who still don't think we've gone far enough. And they make it very clear, and this latest biological opinion appears to be headed towards litigation, and that's something we're going to have to deal with. There are a lot of folks who still think we should be spilling a lot more water over the top of these dams. We just don't see it. We don't see the scientific value, and we're not seeing the economic proposition. And we think that although the dams have had significant impacts, they've also enabled our modern way of life. And this zero carbon hydro resource is also an incredible source of benefit for this region. So it's a balancing act. And I think you got to stay true to the science. You got to make sure you're making good decisions. You got to help people understand that we're moving in the right direction, and that at the end of the day, we can still make progress, but let's count our blessings too.
Thank you. I want to turn to energy efficiency. Governor Kitzhaber's 10-year energy action plan calls for maximizing energy efficiency and conservation to meet 100% of the new load. What is BPA doing to advance energy efficiency?
A lot. It's funny, energy efficiency is just like part of the way of life in the Pacific Northwest. One of the statistics I love to quote is since 1980, I think, the region has built a 5,900 megawatt conservation power plant. That means we have invested to the tune, we have invested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to build essentially an invisible facility that produces effectively zero carbon negawatts all the time. Okay? And this region has just been very dedicated to energy efficiency. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council sets very ambitious targets for energy efficiency, and at Bonneville we do everything we possibly can to try to meet those targets. So we're very focused on energy efficiency. We're going to continue to carry the flag for energy efficiency. But what I say to people, particularly today, is we have a lot of different competing demands on the system. We have the capital program for power and transmission. We have the spending on fish and wildlife. We have energy efficiency, other forms of grid modernization. And we have to think about this all as sort of part of a holistic whole. And there's a big balancing act. That's always been this sort of essential challenge, not only of the Bonneville Power Administrator, but I think of other regional energy leaders. How do you find that sweet spot between jobs and the environment and the economy? So we got to keep pushing as hard as we can on energy efficiency and renewables and all the important public purpose stuff, but we got to do it in a way that maintains the economic vitality of the region. And I think that's kind of our essential challenge.
Yeah. And I guess that leads to another question. One fact that I learned in preparing for this interview is that in addition to managing the federal hydropower and transmission assets, BPA also markets the energy produced at the nuclear power plant, the Columbia Generating Station on the Hanford site in Richland, Washington. What role do you think that nuclear power has in the nation's energy future? And do you think another nuclear plant will ever be built in the Pacific Northwest?
Boy. Boy, my crystal ball on the future of nukes in the Northwest is pretty cloudy, I would say. We do have our one regional operating nuclear plant, the Columbia Generating Station. It's 1,150 megawatts, and that plant has been pretty trustworthy source of carbon-free energy for us for quite a while, and I think that plant's going to be around for a bit. In terms of building another nuclear plant in this region, I think it's going to be controversial. I know that there are folks certainly within in Washington, the department, who are hoping that we can get into a new generation of sort of advanced modular nukes. There may be some hope there. But boy, a lot of big issues around storage and around waste management and costs are going to have to be wrestled to the ground before we start building nuclear plants again. So I probably wouldn't bet a ton of money on it, but it's part of the distribution.
So it's been a little more than a century since the first of the hydroelectric plants came online. Both the change in the industry and the rate of change have increased exponentially. And I wanted to give you a chance during this interview to tell us what are the current challenges in the electric power industry that you're facing. What do you see on the horizon for upcoming change that you haven't had yet a chance to address here today?
Well, I'd probably say I've mentioned aging assets and the challenges of physical security and cybersecurity. New regulations have sort of had the utility industry a little bit flummoxed. Where's the country going on carbon regulation? Where's the country going on renewables? We don't have a great, clear policy on some of those issues, and it creates a lot of uncertainty for utilities in terms of how they should be planning long-term for their resource base. That's a problem. I think that the potential for distributed generation and high penetration of renewables is going to continue to be a big issue. Down in California, in the Pacific Northwest, we went through our big wind build out back from 2007 through 2012. Slowed down a little bit before the next big ratchet of public policy kicks in again. California, they're putting thousands of megawatts of solar energy into their system.
And when you say distributed generation, you're referring to?
Smaller scale projects built more towards the load as opposed to big bulk generation. And in California, I think the big move towards solar is going to have a profound impact on the way that capacity is managed in the system, the price of electricity, and just the way the system is operated. The flow of power between California and the Pacific Northwest, which has traditionally been kind of a winter-summer exchange, could completely change. It's really interesting. So new technology, distributed generation, regulation, smart grid, and new communications infrastructure, I think those are the big ones that many of us are grappling with.
And you mentioned all of the wind, and a lot about BPA's role in integrating wind into its portfolio has been written about, but I thought since you were kind of a leader on that issue, you could talk a little bit more about where BPA is on that particular challenge.
Well, it's been a really, really great ride. I mean, it's been full of interesting challenges. It's forced us to kind of rethink the way that we schedule energy and the way that we manage the power system. But at the end of the day, I feel very proud that we've been able to work with great regional organizations, the utilities, Renewable Northwest Project, a lot of great partners to get that power on the grid and do it reliably. So I think our grandchildren are going to thank us for that over time, because that's a source of zero carbon resource that we'll be producing for many years. The next chapter is still to be written, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. So we're now going to open up to the Q&A portion of the program. If you have written a question on an index card, please hold it up high so the City Club staff can collect it from you.
Steve Shell, member. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Columbia River Treaty. Specifically, I'm concerned about whether or not Bonneville is going to have to pay more in order to encourage the necessary fish responses and also the water storage problems that, in essence, Canada provides for the United States. Are we going to have to renegotiate that treaty? We have to make that decision this year, or at least start the process this year to give the 10-year notice. Could you speak a little bit about where Bonneville is on that basic issue?
Yes, the Columbia River Treaty, which was actually signed in 1961 and then ratified in 1964, has been a very, very important piece of international agreements between Canada and the U.S. Really has a huge impact on the way that water is stored and released on the river. And as the questioner asked, it is subject to potential termination beginning this September with 10 years notice going to 2024. So we've just spent the last 3 years, quite frankly, working with regional tribes and states and other interests to propose a recommendation for the future of that treaty. And what we're basically saying is that we believe that the treaty has become somewhat outdated in terms of the flow of dollars between Canada and the United States. We think we're shipping back too much capacity and energy to them based off what was originally expected. We think that flood risk management and irrigation, navigation, other critical water uses need to be preserved so we don't have massive flooding in the lower part of the river. And we think that there needs to be a place within the treaty context to deal with ecosystem issues. When the treaty was signed back in the 60s, that wasn't a major priority. Today, with the tribes, the environmental interests, they want to have a place for us to adapt to climate change impacts and to be able to sort of codify some of the things that we've done on more of an ad hoc basis in the treaty over the last decade. So our hope is that to try to renegotiate or adjust the treaty to shift some of those equities and to modernize it to reflect modern values and modern operational realities.
Ted Kay, City Club member. A question on the challenges your infrastructure efforts face. In Wishram, Washington, BPA is building a new 243-foot transmission tower on a culturally sensitive site. Not only is it near Lewis and Clark's Celilo Portage route, it contains a cave sacred to the Yakima tribe with ancient images on the cave wall. While there is a smaller tower there now, blasting for the new tower threatens the sacred site. The landowner and the tribe are fighting BPA, which I understand has moved the tower site 20 feet and is mostly paying money to mitigate the impact rather than to prevent the damage. Would you please comment on this?
Sure. I'm not personally versed in that very, very specific instance that you're speaking about. But what I can say with my experience in working with the Yakima tribe in the gorge area, in those sensitive areas, is I personally feel as though we've had quite a bit of success in general in working with them to deal with those extremely sensitive issues. We recognize that in trying to build transmission in those areas, we're dealing with some very, very sacred ancestral sites that are of extraordinarily cultural significance to people there. And we've worked, quite frankly, very closely with the tribes to be as acutely sensitive to those issues as we can. We've signed settlement agreements with them. And personally, especially with respect to the Big Eddy Night line that we're building across the Columbia, I feel as though things are moving in generally the right direction. But I can certainly, I think it's a reasonable question, and I'll go back and redouble and see if there's anything I should be paying attention to.
Peter Fenner, member of City Club. I wonder if you would comment on Bonneville's reaction, or your own opinion if they have no reaction at this point, on the proposals that I've heard using electric cars as a backup to the grid, so that, for example, solar energy produced during the day, which is not available at night, could shift over to drawing power from cars, electric cars.
It is absolutely a credible scenario, and it's happening in small scale in different parts of the world, in different parts of the country. The issue today is you don't have that many of the vehicles on the road yet, but as they scale up and they have the electronics that can actually time or even respond to price signals from the grid to determine whether they should be storing electricity or releasing it back to the grid. Not only can they be just sort of unidirectional batteries, but they can actually be bidirectional sources of distributed flexibility for the power system. So that is happening back in the East Coast, in PJM, I think, one of the big interconnections of the East Coast. They actually have electric vehicles that are being paid to provide ancillary services to the power system. So that's doable. It's just a number of years before it gets scaled up.
This is sort of a follow-up. Rick York, City Club member. One of the biggest issues with renewables, except to some extent hydropower, is storage. What, if anything, is BPA doing to create or improve the storage of renewable electricity?
It's a great question. Boy, storage is definitely the holy grail in a lot of ways. And the nice thing, though, is we're actually making some progress. A couple things to point out. First of all, we have a technology innovation program that we administer at Bonneville, and several of our projects are focused on battery technology and working with companies who are developing different types of technology, lithium-ion, flow-based batteries, to see how they perform with the grid. And so far, the results are actually quite interesting. We are also part of something known as the Pacific Northwest Smart Grid Demonstration Project, which is a big consortium of utilities that are looking at different types of distributed storage and technologies. And one of the projects, the Smart Grid, is actually a Portland General project where they've built a pretty significant bank of lithium-ion batteries down in Salem, as sort of the Salem Smart Energy Facility. It is phenomenal to see that facility. And then Portland is learning a ton of really interesting stuff, and we're going to learn from them as well. So I think with battery storage, we just need to keep a consistent, steady trickle of investment in R&D, and over time, we could find ourselves with a resource that could just be extraordinarily valuable to integrating renewables, managing transmission congestion, and otherwise keeping the lights on.
I just want to follow up on that question to ask if you have any sense when that kind of large-scale storage might be available?
Well, you know, I honestly believe in the next decade we're going to see a real breakthrough. I think that there's a pretty significant amount of basic research, and I think we're finally seeing utilities. We have another one of our big customers up north, Snohomish County PD, is investing in storage. They're making the investments, and every one of those investments creates a little bit more of an economy of scale, a little bit more learning, another sense of the value proposition. And I think I think we're going to get there. I really am optimistic.
Rob Rostoff, City Club. Back when Grand Coulee Dam was built, it blocked approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the river for salmon. And I'm wondering, are there any plans to retrofit that dam?
I would say at the moment there aren't any plans to retrofit the dam. It is something that continues to be of very high priority to a number of the Upper Columbia River tribes, including some of the tribes up in Canada. It's something that's part of the dialogue, quite frankly, around the Columbia River Treaty, but it's going to be a major question of not only ecological sustainability in terms of what it would look like to reintroduce species upstream and whether they could actually survive given the types of habitat changes that have happened upstream of Grand Coulee, but also just it will be a question of economics as well, whether society is prepared to pay that kind of a price. But it was clearly a decision that was made, had major implications, and at this point I don't see anything happening in the very, very short term, but it will continue to be studied.
Hi, Rachel Shimshak, City Club member. I want to thank you for all that you've done to encourage renewable energy activity in the Northwest. We've made a lot of progress, but we're on the cusp of, between now and 2025, seeing 2,500 megawatts of coal facilities retire in the Northwest. That's thanks to the good work of Portland General Electric and other utilities that are transitioning their resources. Can you say what you're prioritizing at Bonneville, given your statute to encourage the development of new renewables? What are you going to be doing to help replace that 2,500 megawatts with clean, renewable energy that we know the citizens of the Northwest want?
I think we're doing a couple big things, and I guess probably the most foundational thing that we're trying to do is, as I mentioned earlier, we put about close to 5,000 megawatts of wind energy onto the Bonneville power system in the last decade. That's a lot of wind energy for a system that only has a peak load of about 10,000 megawatts. And the federal dams themselves are getting pretty close to their edge of flexibility to follow all that volatility from the wind turbines. So what we're trying to do to not only just to continue to maintain reliability, but to enable the next generation of renewables and to maintain a truly resilient and flexible grid is to bring the different system operators in the region together, to look for ways that they can pool diversity and share resources through more efficient operations, and to look for ways to buy and sell capacity and energy from each other and make very, very best use of our existing resources through broader coordination. And my hope is that, you know, renewables integration is not the only reason we're doing that. We're trying to do that for reliability and economic efficiency and transmission asset utilization, but that will lay the foundation for a strong and resilient grid so that 5, 6, 7 years from now, if we decide that we're going to want to replace some of those resources with renewables, that the grid will be able to accommodate them without significant reliability problems. I think that's probably the biggest thing we're thinking about at BPA. And then, of course, really trying to make sure that we can do the transmission planning and other resource planning that will be necessary to make sure that those resources and the other types of resources that may be developed alongside of them can be efficiently accommodated into the system.
Kurt Wabering, member. Facetiously, I was going to ask you, how do you get sleep at night? But regarding aging infrastructure, you mentioned an investment plan, and also that $900 million went back to the feds as a payment. Can you give us a sense, either in dollars or % of your budget, how much is going for the investment plan?
Right now, our capital program in the last few years has been pushing close to $1 billion a year of capital expenditure between power and transmission, energy efficiency, fish and wildlife, IT, facilities. And as we look out over the next decade or so, we're not sure we're going to be able to sustain things at that level, but it's going to be probably somewhere in the $700 to $800, $900 million a year of spend. And to be able to accommodate that in a way that doesn't have huge price shock or rate shock impacts for our customers is going to take serious long-term planning and creative thinking about our cost structure, about our debt portfolio, and about the way that we stage those investments. Make sure we're doing the highest priority, highest risk investments up front, and then staging them so that we can give people some certainty about what our investment profile is going to look like. So you talk about losing sleep, I would say, you know, the capital program has become pretty much my single largest focus as administrator.
So I've been told that I have time for just one question from the written questions from the audience. You spoke about the challenges of permitting new transmission lines. Should we be doing more with distribution power sources, such as Germany is doing with extensive solar roof installations?
You know, it's interesting. I've sort of grown up as a wholesale power guy. You know, I work for the bulk grid, Bonneville. We sell at wholesale. I'm not really super knowledgeable about the distribution side. I think there's going to be a role for that, and there will be a role for distribution and building resources at the sort of the load side. But I think that you're also going to see for the foreseeable future a pretty significant focus on larger scale, more centralized kind of development, bigger wind plants, bigger solar plants. I think you get economies of scale out of those that I think will tend to be a little bit cheaper. Also, many of the utilities, not Bonneville as much, are really having to grapple today with the rate and cost implications of all that distributed generation. It's probably going to cause them to change the way that they charge for power, because as more and more people take themselves off the system, they're leaving a big package of fixed costs left for the rest of their customers to pick up. And they're having to start playing around with rate design to figure out how to avoid what some of them have called this death spiral. So it's a big issue for our retail utilities. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa.
Unfortunately, we've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week for Ending Homelessness, Pipe Dream, or Possibility with Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And as we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to BPA Administrator Elliot Mainzier and Lisa Rackner. We are adjourned.